Hey everyone, what's up? It's Babylonius from PeakofSerenity.com, formerly of WalkingTheWind.com. So I'm here bringing to you the 7.2 Windwalker Legendary quote-unquote tier list. These are based on the changes in 7.2, so I'll cover some of those as well as go through the legendaries we have access to and my thoughts on them. Unlike last time, these are entirely based on my own thoughts. We haven't had enough time for people to play with the changes where really getting a group opinion would be very relevant. But people keep clamoring for a video like this, so here you go. Alright, so this was the previous tier list. This was what it looked like before 7.2, where some things got nerfed, some things got buffed. So yeah, so this is what it looks like, and this is what it looks like now. Totally blank, and that's largely because every legendary that we have access to really has its place, its situation. It's strong at some times and weak at others. Some of them are just kind of all around, but in general, there's a lot more situational uses between the legendaries. So you putting them in an exact tier list is going to be pretty much useless. So what we're going to do is I'm going to cover each legendary. I'm going to go alphabetically. I'm going to cover each legendary and talk about when it's strong and how it fares in a variety of situations. So first up, we have Cenedril, Reflector of Hatred. That is a cloak. As you can see, it's got some haste, some mastery, and what it does is Touch of Karma deals 150% increased damage based on your absorb. Normally, it deals 75% of your health. So after this, it does 125% of your health in damage. So some of the pros, it's very easy to use. You just hit Touch of Karma and boom, there you go. It's a nice extra damage when you're using a defensive cooldown like Touch of Karma, or you can, of course, use it offensively. Some of the cons are obviously that if you want to get the maximum use out of it offensively, you have to give up using one of your defensives. You might have to stand in something, piss off your healers, your raid leaders, stuff like that. So it also is really just single target. It doesn't scale with AoE, and then of course it takes up a slot for tier pieces, which currently we're looking at the potential of going with 6 tier pieces, 4 from, I should say 4 from tier 19 and 2 from tier 20, or 4 from tier 20 and 2 from tier 19 at least. There's some possibility there, which of course would really hurt the value of one of these legendaries, some of these legendaries that take up a tier slot, because then you couldn't do that. So looking at the ratings, again, these are entirely based on me, and they are not necessarily consistent with the previous list. For single target, it gets a pretty solid A-. If you looked at the previous slide, it's a S, then A, B, C, D, E, F, similar to an American grading scale, except we don't have S at the top, obviously. I don't know why S seems to be at the top of tier lists, but that's the normal way of doing it, so that's how we're going to do it. So Cenedril, single target is an A-. Cleave, it falls to a B because it doesn't scale with additional targets, and in AoE, it falls to a C because, again, it doesn't scale with additional targets. So really, it's primarily a single target legendary. It's kind of it's a decent one. It's not one of the best, but if you have it, it's pretty good for single target, and like I said, it's pretty easy to use. So next up, we have Cindaria the Symbiote. It is a belt legendary. Some of the pros, what it does is your attacks deal an additional 30% damage to any enemy above 90% health, and it also heals you for 100% of the damage taken, which is a pretty noticeable chunk of damage in some situations. So as you can see, it's got a bunch of crit, a decent amount of mastery. Some of the pros, it's a good, strong damage. It's easy to use. It syncs well with burst like Serenity and stuff like that at the beginning of a fight. It's at its strongest typically during the hardest of encounters. It's a good kind of all-around legendary. It's useful in AoE, single target, cleave, stuff like that. And as things get harder, they typically have more health. Or ads have more health or stuff like that, so Cindaria gets a little bit of an extra damage boost against harder content. Some of the cons is that it's less useful in burst AoE, where things may have less health, so they may be below 90% before you really start wailing on them. And it's less useful on fights like Star Augur or whatever, some other fights, Botanist, where the priority, the biggest damage phase that you really need is at the end of the fight, where you're really trying to finish the boss off, or maybe there's an enrage mechanic, something like that. So, it gets a great boost at the beginning, but it's not quite as functionally useful if you're really trying to bring the DPS as much as possible at the end of the fight. Because it's a decent all-around legendary, it's pretty good. It gets A- across the board. It's useful in single target cleave AoE. If you're able to get the first hits in cleave and AoE when the targets are still above 90%, 30% on top of our pretty strong AoE is quite a lot of damage. And for all you Serenity lovers, this is a little bit stronger with Serenity because of the burst at the beginning of the fight on the pull. So next we have Drinking Horn Cover. This legendary was changed in 7.2 if you've missed out and haven't been reading my articles or podcasts or anything like that. So this was previously an S tier legendary. It was just about the second strongest behind Katsuo's. And now what they did was they reduced the duration that Storm, Earth, and Fire is extended by from 0.6 seconds per chi spent to 0.4. Which is a pretty noticeable nerf. And they added Serenity, which increases Serenity uptime by 0.3 seconds for every chi spender you cast. What this does for Serenity is it allows you to keep Serenity up for about 11 to 13 seconds, which is a pretty decent boost. So the nice things about this legendary, the pros, it's relatively easy to use, especially if you learn how to pool. It can increase Storm, Earth, and Fire and Serenity's uptime by 25% or more. It's very strong in continuous AoE where you're really pumping out a lot of spinning crane kicks, which spend a lot of chi at a time. That tends to increase the duration by the most. So it's very strong in sustained AoE. It syncs well with Bloodlust and other haste buffs, which increase your regen and your resource generation, which increases the amount you can spend. And what it does for those of you who like Serenity, it makes Serenity viable again. So if you have the Drinking Horn cover and you like Serenity, then by all means go Serenity. If you feel that you're good with it, then you can do that now. Some of the cons is that Storm, Earth, and Fire still has some bugs. And it is slightly, although realistically, not more difficult to use with Katsuo's, because Katsuo's decreases the chi spent, the chi cost of Fist of Fury by 1, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But so in technically, it's a little bit more difficult to use with Katsuo's, but it's really just 1 chi, a blackout kick, or something like that. It's not functionally really that much more difficult. And even despite the buffs, this legendary is still pretty strong. I gave it A's across the board. It's very strong, pretty much one of our strongest all-around legendaries still. So the people who were crying that the sky was falling were not quite correct. Next is the Emperor's Capacitor, and this one has gone with the biggest change in 7.2, at least in my opinion, in terms of its usefulness. And what happens is the chi spenders that you cast increase the damage of your Crackling Jade Lightning by 100% and reduce its cost by 5%, stacking up to 20 times. You get a buff that has 20 stacks, and then when you cast Crackling Jade Lightning, it does a ton of damage. So the pros is that it is incredibly strong with Serenity, because Serenity increases the amount of chi spenders you can cast, especially at the beginning of the fight. It allows you to build up these charges and these stacks very quickly, and use them into nice strong bursts. And it's even stronger with Drinking Horn cover, because obviously more Serenity equals more casts. And it also has a ton of stats. As you can see, a lot of crit, a decent chunk of mastery, a ton of agility. Being a 940 item brings 3,500. That's a weird way of saying it. 3,150 agility. So that's just a ton of stats. There aren't really any other legendaries that Windwalker has access to that's going to provide that much agility over a comparative item, except for maybe the trinkets. Some of the issues with it is that it does not scale with targets. Crackling Jade Lightning is specifically a single target ability at the moment. Who knows in the future if they'll allow us to be really like a Dark Jedi casting lightning. If you have Katsuos in the T19 tier bonus, can make it a little bit more difficult to find a spot to use Crackling Jade Lightning. Ideally, you want to cast Crackling Jade Lightning as close to 20 stacks as possible without going over. You do not want to waste stacks. You do not want to cast it during Serenity if you have Drinking Horn cover, because it does not spend chi, and thus it does not increase the duration. But if you don't have Drinking Horn cover, you can cast it during Serenity. You can cast it during Storm, Earth, and Fire. The clones will get the damage bonus of it. So it can do a lot of damage that way. Another con is that you cannot move while channeling, which is relatively unique for Windwalker mechanics, so people may not be used to it. And then, of course, it's one less slot for the tier pieces, like I said earlier, which may become more of an issue in the future. Single target, it is the best available legendary, big old S. Cleave, it loses some of its power because even in 2 targets, you can really only make use of this on half of them. And typically with Cleave and AoE, you are using bigger chi spenders, like Spinning Crane Kick, and instead of Rising Sun Kick and Blackout Kick, so you use less chi spenders, which results in less stacks and stuff like that. And then that's why in AoE it's kind of a B-. But in single target or priority damage, even if there are adds, but you need to focus on killing this target and this boss, Emperor's Capacitor is currently as good as it comes, especially if you compare it with Drinking Horn cover and are decent enough with Serenity to make the use out of it. So next we have Hidden Master's Forbidden Touch. This one's also gone through a pretty large change. Previously this was just about considered the worst possible legendary you could get in terms of its usefulness. And what it does now, it increases the damage of your Touch of Death by 40%, which is a huge amount. And it can be used a second time within 5 seconds before its cooldown is triggered. So you can put Touch of Death on 2 targets. They will deal 40% increased damage, which is a bunch of damage, because it's half of your health multiplied by mastery. So then you add another 40% of that is a ton of damage. It does not count Gale Burst. It is pre-Gale Burst, but it's still a pretty respectable amount of damage. So the pros is that it's decent, if not really great damage when it's usable. On single target, it's decent. On Cleave or on 2 targets, it's just about the best we got. If you can use, especially if you can do a bunch of Cleave to get extra Gale Burst on both targets, it can really do a lot of damage. So some of the cons is that it does not scale with more than 2 targets. You have to be in range of 2 targets. You have to cast an ability in between so that you don't lose hit combo or your mastery bonus. And as with some of the other ones, it uses a tier slot, like I said, which may become a big deal in the future. So Hidden Masters has gone through quite a change previously. Like I said, it was just about the worst legendary. Now I'm going to give it a B+ for single target. It's a pretty decent single target. 40% increased damage is a good chunk. Cleave, I wanted to give it an S, but as Cleave is not necessarily just 2 targets, I gave it an A+. But like I said, if you have 2 targets, if there's ever a fight like Twin Ogren back in High Mall or something where there's 2 consistent targets throughout the whole fight, Botanist on Heroic, for example, and lower, where you can really use it on both targets and just go bananas, this legendary is incredibly strong. And then AoE, I have to give it a B- because it does fall off to other legendaries as you gain more targets. The Touch of Death becomes a smaller and smaller portion of your overall damage because it doesn't scale beyond 2. Next we have Katsuo's Eclipse. This was previously the undisputed king of Windwalker legendaries. And what it did previously was it reduced the cost of Fist of Fury by 2. So from 3 to 1, and now it reduced the cost of Fist of Fury by 1, so from 3 to 2. The pros of this legendary is it works very well with the T19 2-piece because that increases the amount of Rising Sun Kick damage, so you have this extra chi to use on more Rising Sun Kicks without needing to toss in Blackout Kicks. It slows the rotation down. It provides an extra chi for spinning Crane Kick in AoE, which is a pretty decent amount of damage. It makes Fist of Fury much easier to use. It requires less planning. You can just use a jab before and have the chi for Fist of Fury. It is useful in all situations. Some of the cons is that it moves the rotation closer to global cooldown cap because you are casting more blackout kicks, just a little bit more, but more nonetheless. So less planning time and less room for mistakes, especially without the T19 two-piece bonus. The two-piece kind of gives you more time to plan, and Katsuo's kind of takes away some of that planning time. So there's a little bit of a balance. But certainly in the future, if you're going to be using Katsuo's without the two-piece, you're going to have less time to plan things, which makes more room for mistakes. I personally love it at 1 chi as opposed to 2. A lot of people are not a fan of that, but I personally love it. I think it fits very well. So my ratings for this, I give it a solid A in single target and cleave. And in AoE, it gets an A+, because of that providing an extra chi for spinning Crane Kick. It keeps Fist of Fury relevant a little bit longer, which is great. So, yeah, like I said, AA and then A+. Kill Jaden's Burning Wish is a trinket. What it does is when you use it, it sends out a, as it says, a vortex of destruction that seeks your current enemy within 10 yards. And then when it reaches your target, it explodes, dealing a critical strike to all enemies within 10 yards. So if things are grouped up, this is a really great legendary. Some of the pros, it scales very, very well with multiple targets. It's strong in dungeons and fights like Spellblade, Allurio, where the targets are all very, very close. It has very high stats. As you can see, it's got a lot of agility and a smidge of the other secondary stats. Some of the cons is that it uses a trinket spot. There aren't any really intensely strong trinkets for Windwalkers at the moment, to where that would hurt us quite a bit, but there's always the potential in the future for a very strong trinket. So Kill Jaden's would eat up one of your trinket spots, but it could also open up a spot for a tier piece, because it doesn't take up a tier piece slot. So for ratings, I give it a B+. It's a decent single target trinket, but once you start getting into cleave and AoE, it's very strong. Definitely a nice solid A. Not spectacular, but if you have it, chances are you can make a decent amount of use out of it. It's got a good cooldown. You can save it a little bit to hit a bunch of targets, especially on a fight like Spellblade during the Frost or the Arcane phases where everything's nice and grouped up. It's a very strong legendary in those situations. So if you have it, it's a good trinket to have. Next we get to March of the Legion. March of the Legion is a ring. March of the Legion got a little bit. It got an additional stat to it. They added Mastery. Took a little bit away from Haste in 7.2. So as you can see, it has a metric ton of secondary stats. It's got, as you can see, about 4,400 secondary stats plus a socket. It doesn't have any agility, but that's a lot of secondary stats. So some of the pros for this is that it's movement speed increase for players inside of 10 yards. It increases their movement speed by up to 25%. Through our Windwalking aura, we normally give 10, but this bumps it up to 25. So when you can use the movement, nothing's going to beat it. If it keeps you out of fire, if it gets you or somebody else out of fire or out of damage that would otherwise kill them, it's going to be very difficult to beat this ring. Some specs, like DKs and stuff, I've heard give thanks for this legendary because they have very little mobility, which helps them a lot. So some of the cons is that there really isn't a direct DPS boost outside of the stats themselves, because you can't really just take movement speed and translate that particularly into DPS. It's completely useless on fights with very limited movement. Windwalkers have a ton of mobility already. And typically, the better you and your group performs, the less useful the movement speed bonus is. If you guys have no problem getting out of fire with the 10% movement speed or with 0% movement speed increase, then getting 25% is not going to be magical. It may provide a little bit more sticking to the boss and stuff like that. But in general, if you don't need it, it's going to be useless. If you do need it, it's going to be just about unrivaled. So it's a very, very, very situational legendary. Because of that, I have to give it pretty much C minuses across the board in terms of damage. But if you're ever in a foot race, it's certainly a nice big S. That additional 15% in a foot race will certainly help you get there faster. So what you're going to want to do is Flying Serpent Kick ahead of them, and this should make sure that you stay ahead. If they are in your party, you do want to make sure that they don't get the buff as well. So you want to be at least 10 yards away from them so that you can move a little bit faster. If they're smart, they'll try to stick to you. But if you're ever racing on foot, we've done some goofy shenanigans like that in my guild. So it can be very useful in a foot race or running back from a boss. Some people I know have a movement speed set to run back from a boss because, why not? So next we have Prydaz, Xavaric's Magnum Opus, which is a neck piece. Pretty straightforward. Some of the pros is it has a ton of stats, as you can see. It's got just shy of 4,500 secondary stats, crit, haste, and mastery, which is a whole bunch, plus a slot, a gem slot. The other pros is this doesn't require any thought. You don't have to do anything for this. It's a decently strong health bubble. 25% of your maximum health is nice. It's useful for progression. It was very useful on the Mage Tower appearance quest thingy. So some of the cons is that it really doesn't provide a DPS boost outside of the stats. And similar to March, the better that you play and the better that everybody else plays, the less useful the bonus is going to be. If you don't take damage, then the fact that you have a 25% health shield really isn't going to make a big difference. So because of that, ratings, I have to give it a C+. It's got a little bit more stats than March, so it gets C pluses as opposed to March's rating. So C pluses for single target cleave and AoE. But in terms of surviving, it's pretty fantastic. 25% is a ton. If you have people in your raid like me, like I do, who like to seemingly like to go out of their way to try and kill you during a fight, this can really help. If you're prone to making stupid mistakes, then Prydaz is a decent legendary to keep you alive. But in terms of DPS, it's not really going to provide the boost that other things do. But I love it. When I was using it before I got any DPS legendaries, I was very fond of it because, like I said, I do have people who seemingly try to kill me quite a lot. And then last but not least, we have Sephuz's Secret. And this is a ring. It's got a ton of crit, a decent amount of haste, and a slot. And what this does is that when it's equipped, you get a 10% movement speed. This is on top of the 10% you already have. It does stack, as you also get an additional 2% haste. And then if you successfully apply a CC, loss of control, interrupt, dispel, whatever, that effect goes to 70% movement speed and 25% haste for 10 seconds. That can occur once every 30 seconds. So some of the pros is it is crazy strong if you can make use out of the bonus. 25% haste, even though haste is not one of our best stats, as you can see down in the cons. That's a lot of haste. It's basically a smidge off of Bloodlust, and you can use it when you want. If you can make use of it. It's very easy to use the bonus in dungeons, in trash and stuff like that. You can stun. There's always stuff to interrupt. Occasionally things to dispel. So Sephuz is a very strong legendary to have for trash and for dungeons. Some of the cons, it's difficult to make use on a raid boss. There are not many bosses where things can be stunned or interrupted. Sometimes dispels, but often those will be magic, so you can't dispel. And Windwalkers don't get a huge benefit from haste as much as some other stats or as some other classes. So in terms of the strength of this ring, if you're using it without the proc, it's a C. It really isn't very spectacular, but if you can make use of the proc, it is an S+, totally bananas legendary. Especially in a dungeon, if you can use it on cooldown, it is just about the strongest legendary we have. In a dungeon on trash where you can regularly every 30 seconds probably stun something, it's going to be a fantastic legendary. And 70% movement speed is very fast. Plus because it of course stacks with other things. So yes, so that brings us to the end of our legendary list. Hopefully you've enjoyed this version of the video. There are guides and stuff on PeakofSerenity.com, which I highly recommend you checking out. If you want to contact me, have any questions, comments, or just want to bathe in my glory, this is how you can contact me: Discord, Twitter, Twitch, in-game, Battle.net, YouTube, stuff like that. So I do put up other videos on YouTube. I'm getting around to uploading a bunch more guides. And so you can follow me on Twitter and get updates on YouTube. You can subscribe to this YouTube channel. So if you like this video, then please like and subscribe. And this page should say support PeakofSerenity.com. So if you can, please support Peak of Serenity and those of us who make the content for it. Peak of Serenity is a monk site for all specs of monk with a dozen or so contributors. So we all take... I'll do this out of the goodness of our heart. So any donations and stuff are more than welcome. So I hope you like this video. I hope it answers more questions that it creates. And if you like it, please like, comment, subscribe. Let me know your thoughts. If you agree, disagree, feel free to let me know. I don't personally care, but some people like to get it out there. So yeah, until next time, take care.